The year was 1940, and the world was drowning in a tide of grey steel. To walk the streets of London in those days was to walk through a city that felt like a waiting room for the apocalypse. The air was a thick, cloying mixture of coal smoke, damp earth, and the metallic tang of fear that clung to the back of one's throat. Every window was crisscrossed with tape. Every doorway was a dark cavern of sandbags, and every soul was attuned to the distant, rhythmic thrum of the sirens that had become the heartbeat of a nation under siege. But while the public looked to the skies with dread, a small group of men and women, hidden away in the rolling hills of Buckinghamshire, were looking into the very mind of the enemy. At Bletchley Park, inside the cramped, smoke-filled huts of an old Victorian estate, the most important battle of the 20th century was being fought with pencils, paper, and the sheer force of human intellect. The Germans believed their Enigma machine was an impenetrable fortress of mathematics, with its rotors spinning in trillions of possible combinations. It turned the most sensitive military orders into a chaotic alphabet soup. To the Nazi high command, Enigma was the ultimate guarantee of victory, a way to coordinate the U-boat wolf packs in the Atlantic and the Luftwaffe squadrons in the clouds without a single word being understood by the British Tommies. They were wrong. Inside Hut 6, the air was perpetually stale, filled with the scratching of lead on parchment and the frantic clicking of the bombs. The massive electromechanical devices designed by Alan Turing and his team to crack the German code. When a message was finally decrypted, it was known as Ultra. It was the purest form of intelligence ever gathered in the history of warfare. It wasn't just information, it was a ghost in the machine. It allowed the British to hear the whispers of the Luftwaffe generals before they even reached their pilots. But Ultra was a double-edged sword. Its value was absolute, but its existence was a fragile miracle. If the Germans had even the slightest suspicion that their unbreakable code was being read, they would change the system in an afternoon, and Britain would be plunged back into total, lethal blindness. In the first weeks of November 1940, the Ultra intercepts began to pulse with a terrifying new energy. The analysts noticed a surge in radio traffic centered around a massive, coordinated air offensive. The Luftwaffe was preparing something they called Moonlight Sonata. It wasn't just another raid. It was a surgical strike designed to decapitate the industrial capacity of the British Midlands. Churchill, sitting in the bowels of the cabinet war rooms, received the first summaries with a grim silence. "Ich knew that they execute." The secret German radio beams used to guide bombers with terrifying precision were being aligned. The target was becoming clear. It wasn't London's docks or the government buildings of Whitehall. The red lines on the secret maps were converging on the ancient industrial heart of England, the city of Coventry. The weight of this knowledge was a physical burden. Churchill, a man of immense historical ego and deep romanticism, was also a cold-blooded student of Victorian power. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that a leader's duty isn't always to save lives in the present, but to ensure the survival of the future. He paced the narrow corridors of his bunker, the smell of his Romeo y Julieta cigar trailing behind him like a funeral shroud. If he warned Coventry, he ordered a mass evacuation, moved the heavy anti-aircraft batteries from the coast to the Midlands, and scrambled every fighter wing to intercept the bombers over that specific city. The Germans would know. They would look at the British preparedness and realize the only way such a defense was possible was through a breach in their secret communications. To save Coventry was to kill the Ultra secret, and without Ultra, the war was already lost. The moral abyss opened up beneath his feet. On one side was the flesh and blood of his own people, the factory workers, the shopkeepers, the children sleeping in the shadow of Coventry's great cathedral. On the other was the invisible, mathematical shield that was the only thing standing between the British Empire and 1,000 years of Nazi darkness. The decision wasn't just a military one. It was a soul-crushing choice between a visible tragedy and an invisible defeat. Churchill looked at the decrypted cables, the cold, typed letters that foretold the death of a city, and he realized that to be the savior of civilization, he might have to play the role of the silent executioner. The tactical room in the heart of London was a symphony of whispers and the rhythmic clacking of typewriters. It was the middle of November, 1940, and the tension was so thick it felt like a physical pressure against the chest. The men in the room their eyes bloodshot from a lack of sleep and too much caffeine, were looking at a series of radio intercepts that had just been rushed from Bletchley Park. These were the transcripts of Moonlight Sonata, a title that sounded more like a beautiful piece of music than a blueprint for mass destruction. But in the cold light of the subterranean bunker, the beauty vanished. The data was granular. It detailed the fuel loads of the Heinkel bombers, the number of incendiary canisters, and the precise frequencies of the radio beams that would guide the Luftwaffe through the night sky. Outside the bunker, the city of Coventry was breathing its last hours of peace. To understand the scale of what was about to happen, one must understand Coventry in 1940. It was a city where the medieval and the modern lived in a fragile, beautiful embrace. The skyline was dominated by the three spires, a trio of ancient stone towers that had watched over the town for centuries. The greatest of these was the Cathedral of St. Michael, a Gothic masterpiece of red sandstone that held the prayers and the history of generations. Yet, beneath these ancient spires lay the engine room of the British war effort. The factories of Coventry were churning out the very tools that kept the island nation alive: aircraft engines, armored cars, and machine guns. It was a vital organ in the body of the empire, and Churchill knew that if this organ was cut out, the bleeding might never stop. In the cabinet war rooms, the debate was silent but ferocious. Churchill's advisors stood around the map table, their faces pale in the flickering light. Spo of probabilistic outcomes and strategic integrity. They were playing a game of chess where the pieces were made of human lives. If they moved the heavy anti-aircraft guns, the legendary 3.7-inch batteries, from the southern coast to the Midlands, they could create a wall of steel over Coventry. But such a move was impossible to hide. German reconnaissance planes, those silver ghosts that haunted the high altitudes, would see the empty emplacements on the coast and the new ones around the city. The conclusion was a cold, sharp blade. Any extraordinary measure taken to protect Coventry would be a confession. It would tell the enemy that their secret codes were no longer secret. Churchill stood by the window of his office. Though there was no view but the reinforced steel shutters, he thought of the people of Coventry. He thought of the thousands who would head into the air raid shelters that evening, trusting in their government, trusting in the RAF, and trusting in the silence of the night. He was a man who famously said that in wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. But here, the bodyguard was a shroud of silence. He could not send a warning. He could not order a mass evacuation. He could not even tell the local fire brigades to prepare for a firestorm unlike anything seen since the Great Fire of London. To do so would be to gamble with the ultra-secret, and for Churchill, that secret was the only currency that could buy a victory against the darkness. As the afternoon of November 14th faded into a cold, crisp twilight, the German radio beams, the Excurt, began to hum through the air. These invisible paths of electronic signals intersected directly over the center of Coventry. In London, the scientific advisors to the government were frantic. They had developed a way to jam these beams, to bend them so the bombers would drop their loads in the empty countryside. But on this night, due to a series of technical errors and the sheer scale of the German operation, the jamming failed. The beams remained straight and true. The path to the cathedral was illuminated by a cold, mathematical certainty. The trap was set, and the British government, led by the man in the dark coat and the constant cigar, stood by and watched the clock strike the hour of sacrifice. As the clock struck 7 in the evening on November 14th, 1940, a haunting stillness descended upon the Midlands. The moon, nearly full and terrifyingly bright, hung in a cloudless sky, a bomber's moon that offered no place for a city to hide. In the streets of Coventry, the shopkeepers were locking their doors, and the workers from the Daimler and Armstrong Sitley factories were heading home, their boots echoing on the cobblestones. They spoke of the cold, they spoke of the rations, and they looked up at that beautiful, silver moon with a growing sense of unease. They did not know that at that very moment, hundreds of miles away in occupied France, the engines of over 500 bombers were warming up, their vibrations shaking the very earth of the airfields. The first wave of the Luftwaffe, a specialized pathfinder unit known as Kampfgruppe 100, crossed the English coast with surgical precision. These were the masters of the night. Guided by the invisible radio beams, the Churchill's scientists had failed to bend. In London, the reports began to flood into the subterranean control rooms. The radar stations at Ventnor and Poling picked up the massive formations. The blips on the screens were not the usual scattered raids. They were a solid wall of iron moving toward the heart of England. Churchill sat in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests until his knuckles turned as white as the chalk on the tactical maps. He was receiving the news in real time. He knew exactly where they were. And yet, the order to the fighter commands remained frustratingly vague. No massive intercept was launched. The silence from the top was absolute. At 7:20 p.m., the first sirens began to wail in Coventry. It was a sound the citizens had heard before, but tonight the tone felt different longer. More mournful, like a funeral dirge, for a city that was still breathing. Then came the sound. It wasn't the high-pitched whistle of a few planes, but a deep, guttural roar that vibrated in the chests of everyone huddled in their cellars. The first canisters of incendiaries hit the city center. They didn't explode with a bang. They hissed. Thousands of magnesium firebombs scattered across the timbered roofs of the medieval shops and the leaded glass of the cathedral. Within minutes, the heart of Coventry was dotted with thousands of small, brilliant white fires, like a constellation of fallen stars. The German strategy was as brilliant as it was cruel. The incendiaries were designed to start the fires that would act as a beacon for the following waves of heavy bombers. As the fires grew, the second wave arrived, carrying high-explosive Satan bombs that weighed nearly 2,000 kilograms each. These monsters didn't just destroy buildings, they collapsed entire streets. They shattered the water mains, leaving the local fire brigades with empty hoses as they stood before an encroaching wall of flame. The people inside the shelters felt the earth heave. The air became thick with the dust of pulverized brick and the smell of ancient timber being reduced to ash. In the cabinet war rooms, the reports became increasingly horrific. Coventry is burning. The teleprinters chattered. The cathedral is hit. Churchill received these messages like lashes from a whip. He knew that every minute he stayed silent. Every minute he refused to send the full might of the RAF to defend that specific patch of dirt. He was buying another day of life for the ultra-secret. He was trading the red sandstone of St. Michael's for the ability to win the Battle of the Atlantic. He was trading the lives of the civilians in the Midlands for the lives of the sailors on the merchant convoys. It was a cold mathematical trade, but the human cost was being paid in screams and fire. The heat in Coventry was now so intense that it created a phenomenon known as a firestorm. The rising heat sucked in cold air from the outskirts of the city with the force of a hurricane, fanning the flames into a white-hot inferno that reached temperatures of over 1,000 degrees Celsius. People running for their lives were literally swept off their feet by the wind and pulled into the burning buildings. The ancient oak beams of the cathedral, some of which had been there for 500 years, succumbed to the heat. The lead roof melted, pouring down the stone walls like silver blood. The provost of the cathedral, Dick Howard, stood in the ruins, trying to save whatever he could. But the sky was raining fire, and the world he knew was disappearing into a cloud of glowing embers. By 10 o'clock on that night of November 14th, 1940, Coventry had ceased to be a city and had become a sacrificial pyre. The Luftwaffe pilots, flying high above the inferno, reported that they could see the glow of the burning city from over 150 miles away. To them, it looked like a beautiful, pulsating orange jewel set against the black velvet of the English countryside. But on the ground, the beauty was a lie. The air was no longer something humans could breathe. It was a searing, toxic mixture of vaporized lead, pulverized stone, and the scent of burning history. The firestorm was now so powerful that it was uprooting trees and tossing cars into the air like toys. Inside the basement of the council house, the city's leadership sat in a state of stunned disbelief. The telephone lines to London had been severed by the high-explosive mines that drifted down on green silk parachutes. These mines were designed to explode at roof level, blowing the tiles off thousands of houses so that the following incendiaries could fall directly into the wooden interiors. It was total industrial destruction. The local air raid wardens, men in tin hats with nothing but hand pumps and buckets of sand, found themselves facing a sun that had risen in the middle of the night. They looked to the sky, screaming for the RAF, for the Spitfires, for anything to break the relentless cycle of the German engines. But the sky remained a German playground. In London, Churchill was no longer sitting. He was pacing the maps, his shadow cast long and distorted against the concrete walls of the bunker. He was receiving fragmentary reports from mobile radio units on the outskirts of the city. He knew the Cathedral of St. Michael was a torch. He knew the factories producing the precious Hercules engines for the Bristol Beaufighters were being reduced to scrap metal. His military secretaries watched him, waiting for the order to scramble everything, to deviate from the standard patrol zones, and throw every available pilot into the meat grinder over the Midlands. That order never came. Churchill knew that if he suddenly concentrated the entire air defense of Britain over a city that was supposedly a surprise target, the German Abwehr would spend the next morning wondering how the British knew. And if they wondered, they would find the leak. The moral weight of this silence began to take a visible toll. Those who were with Churchill that night described a man who seemed to be aging by the hour. He was protecting a secret that he believed would eventually save millions. But to do so, he had to watch hundreds of his own citizens die in real time. This is the ultra-dilemma in its purest, most brutal form. To have the ears of a god, but the hands of a mortal bound by the cold rules of a global war. In Coventry, the ancient guild hall of St. Mary, where kings had once feasted, was being licked by flames. The library, containing manuscripts from the Middle Ages, was curling into black ash. The history of 1,000 years was being deleted in a single night of strategic necessity. As the third wave of bombers arrived around midnight, the German pilots began to use a new tactic. They dropped massive SC-2000 bombs, known as MACs, which created craters so deep they exposed the very foundations of the city. The noise was no longer a series of explosions. It was a continuous earth-shaking roar that shattered eardrums and drove men to madness in their shelters. Mothers held their children, whispering prayers into ears that could no longer hear, while the ceiling above them groaned under the weight of the collapsing world. The Moonlight Sonata had reached its crescendo, and the conductor of this symphony was a man in London who had chosen to turn his back so that the future might have a chance to breathe. The firemen of Coventry, reinforced by brigades from as far away as Birmingham, were fighting a ghost. They would point their monitors at a burning warehouse, only for the water to turn to steam before it even touched the bricks. The heat was so intense that the rubber tires on the fire engines began to melt and fuse to the cobblestones. When the water mains finally failed completely, the men stood back, their faces blackened, their uniforms singed, and watched as the city was systematically erased. They felt abandoned. They felt forgotten by the government they were working so hard to defend. They did not realize that their sacrifice was the price of a much larger, invisible victory, a victory that was being won in the quiet rooms of Bletchley Park, where the rotors of the Enigma machines continued to turn, unaware that they had just burned a city to the ground. When the sun finally began to rise on the morning of November 15th, 1940, it did not bring light, but a sickly, filtered gray. The smoke from the ruins of Coventry had risen miles into the atmosphere, creating a thick, artificial cloud that blotted out the dawn. The silence that followed the departure of the last Luftwaffe bombers was more terrifying than the roar of the engines had been. It was the silence of a graveyard. As the survivors crawled out of their shelters, their clothes white with the dust of pulverized lime and their eyes red from the acrid fumes, they did not recognize the world they had inhabited just 12 hours before. The center of Coventry was gone. The three spires still stood, but they rose above a landscape of jagged, tithy remains of walls that had stood since the time of the Tudors. The Cathedral of St. Michael was a hollow shell, its great roof gone, its interior a pile of smoldering oak and shattered glass. In the cold morning air, the smell was a haunting mix of wet ash, burst gas mains, and something much darker that the rescue workers did not want to name. Over 500 men, women, and children lay dead beneath the piles of brick, and thousands more were wandering the streets in a state of catatonic shock. In London, the news arrived in waves of grim statistics. Churchill sat at his desk, his breakfast untouched. He was reading the reports of the ultra-intercepts from that morning. The German Air Force was celebrating. Their radio traffic was full of praise for the success of Moonlight Sonata. They believed they had struck a decisive blow against British industry and, More importantly, they believed they had done it with the element of surprise. The ultra-secret was safe. The bodyguard of lies had done its job, but the price of that safety was now being counted in the morgues of the Midlands. Churchill knew he had to visit the city. It was a necessary piece of political theatre, but it was also a moment of personal reckoning. When he arrived in Coventry a few days later, he was met with a complex tapestry of emotions. Some people cheered him, seeing in his bulldog spirit the only hope they had left. Others stood in silent, grim resentment, wondering why the invincible RAF had been nowhere to be found when the bombs were falling. Churchill walked through the ruins of the cathedral, his eyes watering, some said from the smoke, others believed from a rare moment of public grief. He saw the charred cross, two burnt roof beams, tied together by a local priest, and he understood that he had created a martyr out of a city. The strategic value of the sacrifice began to manifest almost immediately. Because the Germans were convinced their codes were secure, they continued to use the Enigma machines for their most sensitive communications. In the weeks following the Coventry raid, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, fueled by a mixture of guilt and a renewed sense of urgency, began to break the German naval codes with even greater frequency. They began to track the U-boat wolf packs in the North Atlantic with terrifying accuracy, the ships carrying the food, the fuel, and the American steel that Britain needed to survive were being guided away from the German hunters because of the intelligence Churchill had protected at the cost of Coventry's streets. This was the brutal, unvarnished reality of the Second World War. It was a conflict of grand, sweeping movements on maps, but it was won or lost in the quiet, agonizing choices of men in rooms who had to weigh the life of a city against the life of an empire. Churchill's decision to let Coventry burn was not an act of malice, but an act of extreme, surgical pragmatism. He had chosen to sacrifice a limb to save the heart. As the industrial ruins of the city began to be cleared, and the factories were rebuilt under the cover of the same ultra-intelligence that had allowed them to be destroyed, the secret remained the most powerful weapon in the British arsenal, weapon forged in the fires of a November night in 1940. As the fires of Coventry cooled into heaps of white ash, the invisible war of intelligence entered its most lethal phase. The German High Command, emboldened by what they perceived as the absolute vulnerability of the British Isles, never once paused to question the security of their communications. To them, the Moonlight Sonata raid was proof that their technology was supreme. They continued to transmit the positions of their U-boat wolf packs, the movements of their panzer divisions in North Africa, and the logistical schedules of their Mediterranean convoys, using the same Enigma rotors that the mines at Bletchley Park were now reading almost in real time. This was the harvest of Churchill's silence. In the months following the destruction of the Midlands, the British Admiralty began to win the Battle of the Atlantic not through superior numbers of ships, but through the superior geometry of information, because Churchill had protected the ultra-secret on that night in November 1940. British destroyers were now appearing exactly where the German submarines were surfacing to recharge their batteries. Merchant ships, laden with the lifeblood of the war effort from the United States, were being diverted around invisible traps with a precision that seemed miraculous to the sailors on board. The sacrifice of 500 civilians in Coventry was now saving tens of thousands of lives on the high seas. But the most profound impact of the ultra-secret, protected at such a staggering human cost, would not be felt until 4 years later. In the spring of 1944, as the Allied forces prepared for Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings, the intelligence gathered from the Enigma intercepts allowed the Allies to conduct the greatest deception in the history of warfare. Because they could read the German responses to their fake radio traffic, the Allies knew for a certainty that Hitler believed the invasion would come at the Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Churchill sat in the same cabinet war rooms, watching the decrypted cables confirm that the German 7th Army was being held back, waiting for an invasion that would never arrive where they expected. If the ultra-secret had been compromised in 1942, save Coventry, the Germans would have spent those 4 years developing a new, truly unbreakable system. The Allies would have gone into the D-Day landings blind, facing a German army that was fully prepared and positioned on the beaches of Normandy. The invasion would have likely turned into a slaughter, a maritime catastrophe that could have extended the war by years or even led to a negotiated peace with the Nazi regime. The 3 spires of Coventry had fallen so that the Atlantic Wall could eventually be breached. The men and women of Bletchley Park lived with a peculiar, heavy burden of ghost-like guilt. They knew that their work was winning the war, but they also knew that their silence had allowed their own neighbors to be bombed. Alan Turing, the father of modern computing, and his colleagues worked in a world where math was a matter of life and death. They understood Churchill's calculus. They knew that in the brutal arithmetic of global conflict, some variables must be sacrificed to solve the final equation. Coventry was the most painful variable of all, a city of red sandstone and medieval glass that was traded for the keys to the German mind. As the war progressed and the tides turned, the story of Coventry was sanitized for the public. It was presented as a tale of British grit and resilience in the face of Nazi barbarism. And while that was true, the deeper, darker truth remained locked in the ultra-files, classified for decades after the guns went silent. Churchill never publicly admitted to the specific choice he made that night. He allowed the myth of a surprise attack to persist, shielding the secret even in the years of peace. He knew that the world was not yet ready to handle the truth of how its freedom had been bought, not just with the courage of soldiers, but with the calculated silence of a leader who watched a city burn from the shadows. For decades after the final echoes of the war had faded, the ruins of Coventry Cathedral stood as a silent, hollowed-out monument to a tragedy that the world thought it understood. It wasn't until the mid-1970s, when the British government finally declassified the existence of the Ultra Secret and the work at Bletchley Park, that the true shape of that night in November 1940 began to emerge from the fog of history. The revelation sent shockwaves through the survivors and the families of those lost. The realization that their sacrifice had been a deliberate, calculated choice by their own Prime Minister was a bitter pill to swallow. A second fire that burned through the memory of the city. Churchill had carried this secret to his grave. He knew that the morality of his decision would be dissected by historians long after his own voice was silenced. But in his own writings, he often alluded to the terrible responsibilities of command. He understood that a leader is not a hero in a storybook. A leader is a man who must occasionally walk through the dark corridors of the soul to find the only exit for a nation. To Churchill, the Ultra Secret was not just a military advantage. It was the ultimate shield of Western civilization. If that shield required the ash of Coventry to stay polished, he was a man prepared to pay that price, regardless of the stain it would leave on his own legacy. The new Coventry Cathedral, built alongside the ruins of the old, stands today as a symbol of reconciliation. The charred cross remains a focal point, a reminder of the fire that consumed the medieval past. But perhaps the true monument is the one we cannot see: the thousands of lives that were saved in the North Atlantic. The soldiers who survived the beaches of Normandy because the Germans never knew their codes were broken. And the ultimate victory over a regime that would have turned the world into a global Coventry. The Ultra Secret, protected by a wall of silence and the sacrifice of a city, shortened the war by at least 2 years. In the cold, hard mathematics of survival, those 2 years represent millions of souls who were never born into a Nazi-occupied world. As we look back at the night the sky burned over the Midlands, we are forced to confront the most uncomfortable truth of history: that freedom is often bought with the currency of the innocent. Churchill's choice was not one between good and evil, but between a catastrophe and a catastrophe. He chose the one that allowed for a future. The silence of the British government in November 1940 was the most powerful weapon they ever deployed. It was a silence that echoed in the empty streets of Coventry. But it was also the silence that allowed the light of liberty to eventually break through the smoke of a continent in flames. The story of Coventry is a warning and a testament. It tells us that in the highest levels of power, information is both a savior and a curse. It reminds us that the men who lead us are often forced into the role of gods, making decisions that no human should ever have to make. As the sun sets over the modern spires of the city today, the shadows still reach back to that terrible night of Moonlight Sonata. But within those shadows lies the secret that won a war, a secret that was worth a city, worth an empire, and worth the soul of the man who had the courage to stay silent while the world burned.